Hi, everyone. I'm Adam Bly. I'm the founder and CEO of a new purpose-driven data and AI startup based in New York and formerly led data at Spotify. Like you, I loved science fairs growing up. They impacted every facet of my life and very much my career in science and technology. I participated in, I think, over 20 science fairs growing up, including in the 1998 ISEF in Texas, where I won Best of Category in Biochem. And today I'm incredibly proud to be giving back as a member of the National Leadership Council of the Society for Science and the Public, the organizer of ISEF. With me today is an incredibly special guest, Vince Cerf, one of the pioneers of the internet, co-designer of the TCP/IP protocol, recipient of the US Presidential Medal of Freedom. Awesome to have this opportunity to chat with you. Thanks so much for joining us. Welcome.
Well, thanks so much, Adam. This is the kind of topic I always enjoy exploring, so I'm really looking forward to the next half hour.
Awesome. So we are very much, I think we both agree, we're very much at an inflection point in the history of the internet and arguably even more broadly in the state of tech and society. And so today I'd love to dig into the state of the internet, issues around access, privacy, truth, zoom out a little bit, look at the relationship between tech and society. We're going to do this all in half an hour. And your questions from you students about tech and COVID. So let's jump in. So let's start kind of big picture, and we'll sort of zoom in as we go. But let's go back to the birth of the internet and kind of frame things a little bit for us in a historical context. What was the original vision? What was on your mind at the time? And when you look at where we are today, where are we, big picture, against that vision?
So the original internet work was inspired, in fact, by a predecessor system called ARPANET, which stood for the Advanced Research Projects Agency Network. That was a Defense Department initiative to link together about a dozen universities and their computers in order to do resource sharing. These were universities studying artificial intelligence and computer science, and ARPA wanted them to share their software, share their computing capability, and advance the state of the art as quickly as possible. Once we were able to build the network and show that diverse different kinds of computers could communicate successfully with each other, we could remotely get access to each other's time-sharing systems, we could get access to their programs, run programs remotely. The Defense Department said, isn't there some way to use computers in command and control? Because it looked like really powerful tools. And at that point, of course, Bob Kahn, who had worked on the ARPANET and was at ARPA at the time in late 1972, began to explore the possibility of using computers in command and control. And one of the problems is that if you're serious about that, the computers are going to end up in mobile vehicles, they'll end up in aircraft, they'll end up in ships at sea. The internet had been designed around dedicated telephone lines connecting dedicated computer centers, air-conditioned rooms. The computers didn't get up and move around. So by the spring of '73, he came to visit me in my lab at Stanford and said, we have a problem. How do we get these different kinds of packet switch networks to interwork with each other, supporting all these different computers in different locations, in different mobility environments, and make it all look uniform? And out of that came about a 6-month effort to create what was then called the TCP protocol, Transmission Control Protocol, which evolved into the Transmission Control and Internet Protocol layered combination. I ended up running that program for DARPA starting in 1976. And the whole vision of it was to outfit people with access to computing capability, the ability to do mobile voice communication, video communication, and access to information, sharing of information, sharing of computing capability in order to do a better job of managing the Defense Department's resources, even both peacetime and in wartime. So that was the motivation behind it. But what was important is that the people who did the actual research to design, build, and deploy the system were researchers, mostly in the computer science departments of several universities around the country. That effort was sufficiently successful that we turned the system on in January of 1983. Not long thereafter, the Department of Energy the National Science Foundation and NASA all decided to build their own pieces of internet, connect their computer capability to it, join together into a multi-network system. And then, of course, the research and academic communities in other parts of the world also got the bug, so to speak, started building their own pieces. The system was designed to allow this aggregation, almost, kind of a biological growth. And then in 1989, we started to see commercial services emerging. So, that's sort of a telescope history, but the idea was driven by applications that were not necessarily strictly militarily oriented.
Yeah. Let's look at the sort of penetration now of the internet, kind of across society, access to this incredible technology and the web that it spawned. There was an interesting survey that Pew conducted just last month, and they found that about half of adults in the US had said that the internet's been essential for them personally during this global COVID pandemic. But as you know well, access to the internet right now is pretty unevenly distributed in the US and around the world. About half the world today doesn't have access. And this is, deepening arguably inequality, structural, economic, that are already in place in the world that we're trying to overcome. So has the pandemic changed your view on this digital divide and sort of the place of the internet in society? Do you see it bending the path towards bridging the digital divide, deepening it? What's your sense of how we come out of this with respect to that divide and access?
Well, first, thank you for framing that question. I have always been concerned about access to internet. I mean, even way back in the early 1990s, I remember writing something called Internet is for Everyone while I was president of the Internet Society, and I still believe that. It was designed to be for everyone, but it isn't yet, and it wasn't then either. So I've been concerned about that for a long time. The pandemic does not ignite that in me, and that fire has been burning for a long time. And it's true that about half the world's population has access, and that half is distributed unevenly around the globe in various countries. Here in the US, for example, rural residents don't have very good access, or maybe not any access to the internet. The Native Americans especially are particularly isolated. But this is also true in inner cities. Sometimes the internet service is not there, or if it is there, it's not affordable. So there are a set of barriers that get in the way of access to the internet. Absolute access is there's no fiber, there's no Wi-Fi, there's no mobile telephony at all, or if it's available, the equipment is too expensive, or the service is too expensive, or is not reliable, is not robust. So there are all kinds of desirable properties of internet access, safety and security and privacy in addition, that need to be satisfied in order for this to continue to be a reliable, useful, and constructive service. Having said that, in the midst of the pandemic, it's very clear that many, many people are using the internet to gather information, to share information, to do their work, in many cases from home. But it also has highlighted that there are many jobs that can't be done that way, that require personal presence. And those jobs often are the lower end of the economic scale. And so the people who don't have jobs that can be done remotely on the internet suffer more relatively than almost everybody else. So having internet access does not solve the problem, the economic problem of not being able to work. Yeah. It might open up an opportunity for someone to do a new job that they didn't do before, and that might turn out to be a partial solution. But we rely a lot on people whose work requires personal presence. And at this stage of the game, we're in a situation that is not sustainable. There are things that need to be done that require personal presence that are not being done. And the economy is suffering as a result. This is not sustainable. We clearly have to get back to work somehow. But getting access to the internet, making it affordable and widely available and resilient will contribute to the next time we encounter a situation like this, whether it's a pandemic or some other global challenge, global warming being another good example of a non-biological threat. So there's lots of motivation right now to get the internet out there, to invest in infrastructure and make it available and useful.
Yeah, and certainly, I mean, create that economic opportunity for the next time. So you touched on privacy, and you touched on sort of getting access to information. Let's fork and kind of look at both of those. So these are two, critical issues with the spread of any extraordinary technology, any major revolution. Of course, there are consequences that are as significant on the maybe deleterious side, on the negative side, as on the positive side, that we need to consider and confront. Let's talk about privacy. So we've seen challenges to individual and individual privacy, as well as privacy for specific segments of the population, as a result of the widespread distribution of the internet and the web. What do you think is happening positively to protect privacy online? Are there things that you think we should be doing more of, either globally or here in the US, to ensure we're on the right track there?
Well, you can see a number of activities that address this question. In Europe, for example, the General Data Protection Regulation is an attempt to create a regime in which people's privacy is protected by regulation. In the US, there is a comparable effort underway in the Congress to try to find a set of rules. But in the meantime, the private sector is trying to adapt to the GDPR so they can do business with companies and people in Europe, for example. And we're seeing other countries adopt or adapt the GDPR concepts into their own legislation. So there's a lot of effort going on to recognize the importance of privacy. Another thing that you can see in my own company at Google is a continued effort to help people understand what information is accumulated in the system, and to allow control over that, to erase some of it, or to say which parts of it should be used and which parts should not, or to allow use of the services without any collection of data at all, in incognito modes of operation. So we're seeing adaptation in recognition of the importance of privacy. I will say, however, that privacy is really hard to come by. And if you're setting aside the commercial side of things, I want you to imagine we have several billion people carrying mobiles around that have cameras and radios in them. They can take pictures of things, they can record video, they can record audio, they can upload it into a variety of platforms, including and especially social media. And so it's very, very hard for any one person anywhere to even know about the possible invasion of their privacy. And it's also not practical to try to get opt-in for everyone. When you take photographs of the town square, and you're just trying to get a picture of the Ratskeller, for example, in Heidelberg, and you get photographs of a whole bunch of other people who are there, you're not going to run around the town square and talk to 100 people and ask if it's okay to put this picture up, because your intent was simply to get a picture of the city hall. But there are people who, if they were recognizable, maybe they're friends, and maybe the facial recognition software identifies them as being at a certain place at a certain time. Some of them might not want other people to know where they were and what date and time. So honestly, privacy is becoming very, very hard to preserve, especially if you're in a kind of public environment. And I think we just have to learn to live with that, because I don't see an obvious solution to that problem. Could I just give you one example of how we had to react to this? When we did Street View at Google, we had cars driving around trying to take pictures of what the world looks like down the streets to help people navigate. And it turned out people and license plates were being captured. And we very quickly discovered people did not want to be recognized, and people did not want their license plates to be seen in the street views. And so we had to build software that automatically blurred out the license plates and people's faces, which meant we had to find the license plates and we had to find the faces in order to blur them out, which we have done. But that's an example of a response to this problem of trying to preserve privacy, even in a public setting.
And you think that ultimately the upside for society, as you consider it today, against the backdrop of where we are in the world, what the original vision is, that's just a risk, that's a price that society should pay?
Well, should pay is a potentially controversial question, but I will say that we have had to adapt over time. as a society to new technologies coming along. I saw headlines, not personally, but looking at old newspapers, in the turn of the century when the Brownie box camera showed up. And there were, these extreme, headlines saying, you can't believe the pictures that people are taking with the Brownie camera. What were they complaining about? People took the camera to the beach and they were taking people in their bathing costumes in the beach. Now, if you remember what a bathing costume looked like in 1900, it went from the neck all the way down to the ankles, but it was still, a big deal. That wasn't appropriate, blah, blah, blah. So we have adapted to that, and we will presumably are adapting to this new regime in the 21st century. So our societies have had to learn to adapt to new technology, and where we think it needs to be constrained, we try to create regulations and we create incentives for following those rules. And if you fail to follow them, maybe there will be consequences.
Let's add two other dimensions to this. So one is the impact that the spread of the internet, the web, associated technologies are having on governance and sort of the health of our public spheres, and the spread of information, of misinformation alongside that, and then just more broadly, the responsibility of those who are inventing, architecting, and leading these technologies and their adoption in society. So first on the health of our public sphere, the health of our democracy. I happen to be particularly concerned about this right now and sort of the state of spread of misinformation in the world. We're talking today to science fair students around the world who are not only practitioners of science, but hopefully advocates of scientific thinking and scientific literacy, and bringing that perspective and that lens to their families and their friends and their teachers and their societies, and advancing rational inquiry and hopefully strengthening our democracies and our society. And yet at the same time, we're seeing this force opposing that, enabled by or amplified by hyperconnectivity of misinformation being able to spread very rapidly through all sorts of technologies built on top of the internet. What's your general sense now of can the damage that has been done to society be undone at whatever level you care to sort of take that up at? And is it your sense that these technologies should be imbued with some sense of value, some sense of controls when it comes to their effect on things as fundamental as the health of our public sphere?
So, kind of broadly, yes, we need to understand what's going on. We need to understand how misinformation and disinformation propagate. And then we have to ask ourselves, how do we mitigate the negative side effects of that without introducing, mechanisms that censor our ability to freely exchange information. And of course, we're in an open society. That's a very important component, or a democratic society. So let me just mention a couple of mechanisms that I think we need to be pay attention to. The first one is that in the social media, there's a feedback loop, which tends to reward people who get attention. How many followers do you have? How many views did you get? How many likes did you get? And these social media mechanisms reinforce what I consider to be extreme behavior and extreme expression, because those tend to get more attention. And so we built in some incentives into the system that I think unwittingly introduce extremism into the environment, the information environment. So we need to understand that better. We really should understand more about human motivation. What is it that drives people to do various things? Why do people vandalize websites? Why do they paint on the walls and feel proud of it? Why do they Zoom bomb, for example? And it's because, haha, you can't stop me, or haha, you don't know who I am, and I did something you couldn't do anything about. Now, I don't know why that's a reward mechanism, but it's there. Now, propagation of misinformation and disinformation. For a long time, I struggled trying to understand how could this be, or why was this? I've come to believe, and I want to say believe, not necessarily conclude, that some of this is almost a consequence of our own evolution. When something is a threat, and it might be fatal, we tend to react instantly, emotionally to this without thinking about it. So if a bear shows up You don't stop to think, I wonder what species the bear is, and are there any more, and how big is the family? It's run like hell. And if you didn't know that, or you didn't somehow ingest that, then you didn't contribute to the future gene pool because the bear ate you. So the warnings, something that is a threat, will tend to propagate much faster. Think about herd behavior, where there are vocalizations of warning that cause stampedes, for example. So we're part of that evolutionary thing. So some of the behavior that we're seeing with regard to misinformation and disinformation is because it is treated as a warning about something. A bad thing will happen if you don't do something right now, like run away or accept the information and react to it. We need to understand those things. We need sociologists and anthropologists and neurologists and others to help the technologists understand how our products and services affect people's behavior. And I don't think we factored this into software and systems design, application design, as much as we should. And so these are things that I believe we are obligated, especially if we're engineers and scientists trying to do the right thing, which is to understand the dynamics of these things and to create systems that mitigate against the bad side effects that these otherwise neutral platforms introduce.
So let's talk about that. I mean, so you introduced the notion of who's involved in building these technologies now, or what disciplines are informing the technologies and their adoption in society. So 4 years ago, another interesting Pew study, 4 years ago, around 70% of Americans, and I apologize to all the non-Americans for these American data points coming from a Canadian, but 70% of Americans thought that tech companies had a positive impact on the country, and that number is now 50%. And negative views of big tech companies has climbed from 17 to 33% in that period. And I think, like you introduced, I believe that the talents and skills sort of around the table need to extend beyond the hard sciences to include sociology and anthropology and economics and behavioral science. But it feels like broadly the culture in tech is broken, and for a generation of technologists and scientists and engineers who are listening, who are thinking about building the next companies and being part of sort of the next generation in tech. If we think about the facets of that culture that are at the root of the data I just shared, if I think about the state of diversity in tech, our broad kind of seemingly lack of social responsibility over some time, and kind of lack of focus on the potential unintended consequences of the technologies that we bring forth with such, oftentimes bravado and bring forth into society. I think we all want to be in a place, especially inventors who are listening, that we have, as a community, we have the standing to bring forth major transformations like the internet in the decades to come that can transform society. So in your view, so I'm curious, really, what do you think is at the root of the shift in perception of the responsibility of technology companies? And is there something about the culture that needs to change, in your estimation, to maintain the standing to bring forth these kinds of important transformations?
Well, first of all, let me point out that the personal responsibility should be part of this equation. And in my view, it is unacceptable to simply blame the tech companies and be done with it. Example, if I could use a metaphor, I think Bob Kahn and I did the work to create a road system, and we gave some rules of the road. Everybody else got to decide what kind of vehicles to build, what kind of buildings to put at the side of the road, and what their functions were. But we gave a few rules so that the cars wouldn't run into each other, or the trucks or bicycles, and we didn't say anything about whether it had to be a bicycle or a tricycle or a truck or something else. But those other things had to be in place, and there are rules of the road. And in the transportation system, we rely on people. We even train them before we give them a license to drive on the road. I'm not necessarily arguing we should have an internet driver's license, but the analogy is sort of appealing in a way. People should understand they have a responsibility for their own behavior on the network, for abusive behavior on the network. Since we can't rely on everybody recognizing this and constraining their behavior, we also have to have mechanisms that say these things are unacceptable in our society, and if we catch you, there will be consequences. To the extent that we can build technology into the system to prevent bad behavior or to inhibit its effect, that's a good thing, but we won't solve all the problems that way. So we have to have a post hoc enforcement. We caught you doing this, there will be consequences. And then finally, we can also say, don't do that, it's wrong. And that sounds wimpy, except that it's like gravity, the weakest force in the universe. But when you have a big mass, it's pretty powerful. It keeps us from flying off the planet. And when you have a large social mass that has adopted certain social norms, that can be very powerful in terms of constraining bad behavior and encouraging good behavior. So let us watch, for example, how people do wearing masks right now. There's a significant shift in where I live in McLean, Virginia, where people are donning masks in order to go into closed environments when they go shopping, for example. And I find myself angry when I see somebody who's not wearing a mask, because they are potentially sharing their germs with everybody else. They're showing disregard and disrespect for other people. You could see a kind of a social norm evolving along those lines. We need the same kind of behavioral norms in the online environment. So we should accept some responsibility. The companies that create the applications need to provide people with tools so they can exercise that responsibility.
You think those norms, speaking to a global community of students, do you think those norms can be set for planet Earth?
Well, there are going to be varying cultural norms that, where we see different cultures in which certain kinds of behavior is accepted and sometimes it's not in other cultures. But there are some sort of common things, like don't harm other people on purpose. And how about don't steal and don't lie and all those sorts of things. So I believe that at least some basics, just, I don't know what to call it, human kindness ought to show up in the norms that we adopt on a global scale. And we also are going to need some international cooperation, because those people who harm others, whether it's a criminal act or not, will need to be tracked down. And so here we get another tension between privacy and our ability to identify harmful behavior by individuals or companies and to respond to that. So there needs to be some international discussion about that.
I want to leave things with some questions from students who are particularly focused on the effect of COVID on society and on tech. So this question comes from Nyiradzo Mutiti in Harare, Zimbabwe.
My question for the Internet Evangelism panel is, how are we going to make the economically unstable countries catch up with the technology advancements that have been happening in the midst of this pandemic?
So as scientists and engineers, one obligation is to drive cost out of these systems in order to make them affordable and sustainable everywhere in the world. And there's huge incentive to do that. So the COVID situation simply highlights the importance of actually achieving that objective. And so to that extent, it's helpful in spite of the pain and danger that it imposes.
And one more from Annie Wang in Pittsburgh, in the US.
My question for the panel is, how has technology improved in response to the pandemic, and what new ones might be developed?
So let me take the second part of the question first, because I'm already seeing remote medicine happening. Doctors saying, call me up on the, do a video call, but please don't come into my office because you might have coronavirus. Remote sensing devices like, the Internet of Things, Fitbit, things like that, could become very helpful in doing remote consults where we can get real data about the state of the patient, even without having to come in. So I think that's going to happen. And I'm pretty sure that we need to do a better job of collating medical information than we have, because people have medical records that are generated by many different doctors and institutions. We need to find a way of combining all those so they're readily available, especially in a remote consult. So those are two things that COVID is highlighting for us to try to pursue.
And hopefully exciting prompts coming from you to students and inventors listening, big opportunities to take this moment and seize it and help bend the world in the right direction. Thank you. With that, I just want to express my appreciation and on behalf of ISEF and the society, and I'm sure everyone listening, it's been a wonderful conversation, and thanks so much for sharing your insights with us.
Well, thank you, Adam. I certainly enjoyed it. And all of you who are watching this, go out there and invent, but do it in a thoughtful way.